Hey everyone, we are the Magic Room and Plant Doctor group. So these are two separate projects that our group worked on. And this commonality that they share is that they both use backscatter networks for sensing. So I'm Shriya.
I'm Sam.
I'm Ollie.
I'm Xiang.
And for the Plant Doctor group, the main question that we tried to answer this summer is how do we transmit sensor data in a low power and low cost way? So, when you think of traditional farming and agriculture, it's really important that farmers know exactly what's going on with their crops. So, the temperature, the soil moisture, any pests that are going on. And in order to figure out all that information, you need sensors. But traditional sensors are very expensive and they also use a lot of power. So, this summer, we wanted to use specific techniques that use wireless sensing, but in a low power and low cost way.
So on the transmitting end, we have this microcontroller setup. This microcontroller, it's like a small computer which takes in data and then turns it into signals with the RF transistor and an antenna. And then it's being powered with a 5-volt DC supply. And then the way we're actually doing this temperature sensing is with this circuit known as a Wheatstone bridge. At a very high level, it does a comparative measurement of these two thermistors, which are like resistors that measure temperature. And it allows you to measure the temperature of plants while still ignoring ambient temperature. So you can see the difference between a plant stem and a plant leaf, even if the temperature of the air surrounding it is changing. And you get really good precision with this. And this is how the Wheatstone bridge actually looks like as a sensor, with these two leads being the temperature sensors. And then we use a known calibrated temperature sensor to turn these resistance values into temperatures, and we get a resistance versus temperature relationship that looks like this logarithmic curve.
So now that we have the sensor information, the question is, how do we transmit this information? And we're using a technique called backscattering, which kind of like a mirror, we take an incoming signal and we reflect it and we add on top of that encoded information. And this uses existing waves and is completely batteryless. So on the receiving end, we're using something called an SDR, which is a software-defined radio, which is basically just a programmable radio. And this allows us to write programs to process these radio waves. And we take the incoming signal and we can decompose it to constituent frequencies, and then we can determine what information is being sent from the microcontroller. So the overall diagram is we have a signal generator, we transmit the information, and using the information from the temperature sensor and the microcontroller, we can reflect that information with backscattering. And on the receiving end, we have an SDR receiving the information and then decoding it into a temperature.
So now we actually have to talk about the plant in question. So the plant chamber is actually located over there. And if you want to take a look afterwards for the demo, feel free to do that. We needed a basic plant that has some broad leaves so then we can clip on the thermistors. And we needed some basic controls such as temperature, humidity, and light controls so that any changes we do notice with the plant are as a result of something that we've done and not just an ambient change that happened.
So this summer we were able to measure temperature on the leaves of plants, but there are other data that we want to collect from the plants, such as like leaf moisture, which would be a capacitive measurement, and we also want to measure electromagnetic and ultrasound because research does show that plants respond to these things, and it could help us get new data about the plants we're looking at. And then we also want to create multi-sensor networks so we can get multiple kinds of data from one plant. And then we also want to send digital signals since those are easier to pick up from the receiving end. And then lastly, we want a larger controlled plant chamber so that we can test multiple plants and we can reduce the number of variables that we're looking at when we're actually collecting data from a specific plant.
So now on to talking about Magic Room, which is the second project we worked on this summer. So this project is all about device-free localization. And the central question that we wanted to answer is how do we localize people without devices? So this is without barcodes or Find My iPhone or any cameras of any sort. The central technology that we use for this is RFID tags. So that stands for radio frequency identification devices. And these also use backscatter radio. And to just put it simply, it just transmits and sends signal. So using a bunch of tags in a room, we can get a bunch of data points. And using that, we can help figure out how many people and where the people are within a room. The reason we need so many tags, in fact, we use 219 tags for this project, is because as shown by this graph, sensor data is very messy. So even when the signals are very close to one another and the tags are very close to one another, it can be really hard to parse out what that information is trying to tell us. So we used a lot of tags to try to figure that out.
So as can be seen here, this is the system that we used. This basically just represents the entire room. So it's 600 centimeters by 800 centimeters. And how the system works here is we have an RFID reader, which is connected to the computer. And basically what it does is that it just tells the antennas what signals to send out. And then it sends out a signal through the antenna, which gets this signal gets absorbed by the RFID tag, which then reflects a signal back at the RFID reader, which contains like important information such as RSSI, which is received signal strength indicator, which is an indicator of like how strong the signal was when it reached the RFID tag. So how exactly is a person's location approximated? So first we had to take calibration measurements, which is basically measurements of the room when it's empty. So the most important thing here is like RSI measurements when the room is empty, because there could be, we're not assuming that the room is empty. We're assuming that there's objects such as like, or in our case, there's a table in the center and there's like lots of chairs. And there could also be like a lot of metal objects, which could cause irregularities because metal objects can reflect signals. And the next part of the algorithm was to filter out irrelevant measurements, such as zero measurements or RFID tags that were on the same wall as the antenna, because they aren't going to produce much useful info if they're right next to the antenna. And then lastly, we formed this heat map here, which is actually our results, by weighing the RSSI measurements in terms of their distance from the antenna that it received the signal from, and the RFID tag that produced that measurement. And so here, this is our results. The person is actually located in that blob right there. And as you can see, it's really messy. It's like a little hard to tell like where exactly they are, but that is what needs to be improved for the future. So yeah, as I said, we need to remove noise from the current heat maps. And this over here is actually an example of some previous work that has done this. As you can see, it still is a bit messy, but it's a lot cleaner than what we were able to produce. And we'd also like to utilize machine learning to analyze these heat maps, because even though it looks extremely easy to determine whether the person is here, as the shape is largely symmetric and it's very obviously saturated at a certain point, there might be other figures where it's like harder to determine where a person exactly is. And yeah.
Any questions? Was that a question back there?
So he was asking, why do we choose to use a Wheatstone bridge instead of a multimeter for our temperature sensing? The reason for that is that we want to implement these in the field where you don't have like multimeters, and this whole system is meant to be batteryless or at least very low power. And with the system that we have set up, it consumes very low current, and it could potentially be powered through ambient waves.
Any other question? Go ahead.
Right now we have a 9-volt battery, but it consumes very little current, and it could be changed to like coin cell batteries, and they would last a very long time. Yes, it is. This is a DC power supply. We didn't measure that, but I know this board itself consumes like in the order of like microamps. So we haven't done that measurement yet, but I expect, and this is just a prototype proof of concept. We likely in the field won't be using MSP 430s, but this board itself consumes not that much power. Yes, they are.